Welcome to the Court of History, and welcome to part two with Clay Risen, our guest today. I'm here with Sean Wilentz of Princeton University. We've been having a riveting conversation with Clay Risen. He's a reporter and editor at the New York Times. He's a historian, the author of The Crowded Hour about Theodore Roosevelt, which received many honors. And he was the editor of the wonderful series at the Times that it published eventually in a book about the Civil War. And most recently, his new book is quite relevantly Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism and the Making of Modern America. We wanted to have Clay on for quite a while, and we did not know that his appearance would be timed to the cancellation of Jimmy Kimmel. And Sean, we've been discussing Hollywood and the Blacklist and the Red Scare there, the rise of Ronald Reagan, the influence of Ayn Rand in the Red Scare, naming names. But let's move on to something else. And because this Red Scare has a real history. It's the early version of the culture war, isn't it, Sean?
Absolutely. That's what we've been talking about. It was directed against precisely those elements that would bring them the most attention. That's to say, the persecutors. You know, if you're going to go after somebody, if you go after a movie star, that's going to get you more attention than if you're going after some librarian someplace. That was number one. But number two was under the pretext that, you know, there was a kind of mind control that was being beamed out of Hollywood. Because communists were doing all the writing and communists were doing this and doing that. There was a real political struggle going on around union organizing and so forth in Hollywood, which is where, you know, Ronald Reagan kind of comes in. But in terms of the larger scheme of things, I mean, in many ways, the culture war today is simply, you know, a continuation of the culture war in the 1940s, 50s, and even into the 1960s.
Yeah, it ramps up though, and it changes after the initial attack on Hollywood. And there's several prominent cases, legal cases, that are brought.
Including one about the man I knew pretty well, not very well, but pretty well, which is Alger Hiss.
You knew Hiss.
Yes.
And the Hiss Chambers, Whitaker Chambers case was one of the signal cases of the Cold War and the Red Scare, and it was in great part responsible for the rise of Richard Nixon as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before I turn to Clay, tell us your impression of Alger Hiss.
Alger Hiss, I got to know because after he was disgraced with the Red Scare and so forth, you know, he couldn't get work as a lawyer. It was going to be very difficult. He got a job selling stationery. And he sold stationery to my father. My father, who was, you know, sympathetic to the plight he was in. So I would see Alger when he came by to the shop to sell the stationery.
Tell us what your father did.
My father was a bookseller in Greenwich Village. And so he needed stationery to do his business. And, you know, he's part of that general world of, you know, leftism sort of, but I mean, beat poetry, the whole business. But, he wanted to make sure that Alger Hiss was his stationery guy. So he would come by the shop and he would hang out. Now, my impression, I was just a kid. I was working at the store. My father believed in child labor, so I worked there as a very young man. But, I remember my first impression, he was very tall and very elegant. And that was part of the story of Alger Hiss, actually, was that he was deemed to be, even though he's from a different kind of Baltimore society, from a different part of Baltimore than Whitaker Chambers, nevertheless, he was thought of as being something of an aristocrat. And that these communists, funnily enough, tended to be aristocrats like, you know, Dean Acheson and Alger Hiss. And Alger Hiss fit. Now, as it happens, of course, we'll talk about this, as Clay was saying in part one, you know, there were people who were actually doing bad things, and it later came out that Alger probably was. But the point was he also fit the model for what the Red Scare people were about in terms of attacking elites, and there's another continuity with today.
Yeah, Clay, tell us about the Hiss case and its importance.
So Alger Hiss, as Sean alluded, was an acolyte of the East Coast establishment. He was a Harvard-trained lawyer. He had come up under Felix Frankfurter, or under Felix Frankfurter at Harvard, and was part of the New Deal. Is sort of the up and coming brain trust, right? And so he ended up working at the State Department. He started in the Agriculture Department, State, and then was the head of the Carnegie Endowment when charges came up from Whittaker Chambers. And Whittaker Chambers had been, and he had admitted this. He said, I was a courier for the Communist Party for the espionage efforts in the 1930s, and I left eventually. I came to very much disagree with the party, but I know people, I know names. And for years, he had been trying to get attention to the fact that he knew people, and he had kind of given up when the Red Scare started taking off, or just look at the Cold War generally. And so he was called to testify, and he said, look, among the people that I know is Alger Hiss. And this became a huge deal overnight. And ultimately, Hiss accused Chambers, Chambers accused Hiss outside of Congress of being a communist. Hiss prepared to sue him, and then Chambers said, I have evidence that you are not just a communist but a spy, and the whole thing ended up in a trial against Hiss for perjury, and he went to jail for it. That's kind of just the very brief outline. I think ultimately, personally, I think Alger Hiss was a spy. I think the evidence is pretty compelling. But to me, it was less about, or at least the way that I focus on in the book, less about whether he was guilty or not, and more about the way that this passion play came to define.
It was a kind of passion play, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it came to define the sides. And I think even today, right? Because at the time there was no middle ground, right? You believed Hiss. And if you believed Hiss, then all kinds of things followed from it. The Red Scare was out, people were out to get people like Alger Hiss. They were out to destroy careers. They were, this nakedly partisan war. If you believe Chambers, then you might just buy into this whole idea that the government and the New Deal especially is riven with communists and fellow travelers, and that we have to do everything we can to get rid of them. And Chambers agreed with all this. I mean, Chambers in his book Witness, he talks about in apocalyptic terms what the challenge facing America was. And I think we still see echoes of this today. I mean, certainly in terms of the rhetoric, right? And the willingness of people to go to 11, right? That it's not just, that Hiss was not just an isolated case, but somehow evidence of every conspiracy theory that you can imagine. And we see that same kind of thing today.
The conspiracy is so immense, as Senator McCarthy put it.
Yeah. And so I think for me, the importance of the Hiss Chambers case was not fundamentally whether Hiss was guilty or not. It was how the case shaped America. And it's important to note, I mean, as much as the Hollywood 10, was front page news, everyone paid attention to it. It wasn't at the time quite seen as the starting gun of this moment, this era. The Hiss Chambers case really was, because it was in Washington, because it's so directly engaged with the Cold War, with politics, with the Democratic establishment. It really defined who was on each side.
It really laid the basis for the rise of Joseph McCarthy, didn't it?
And for Richard Nixon as well.
Yeah. So Nixon's in, I think Nixon is one of the most fascinating characters in this story, because when he came to Washington, he was given the choice of, what do you want to serve on? What committee? And he chose HUAC. And at the time, HUAC was kind of, that was where the cranks and the segregationists and the wingers were. But he saw an opportunity to use it to build his career. And the Hiss Chambers case began with HUAC. So he did a great job. And to be honest, I think Nixon actually really nailed Hiss pretty well. But it's also important to remember that the verdict in the Hiss case, which came out right at the beginning of 1950, was only a few weeks before Joe McCarthy stood up famously in Wheeling, West Virginia, and said, I have in my hand a list of, communists in the State Department. It was primed, right? I mean, how could you not give that credence, having just seen one of the most prominent young diplomats in America be essentially, convicted of espionage?
Yeah, well, McCarthy was, he really took great advantage of it for himself, and sort of took on what HUAC was doing. And, he took it to a different level, and yet he was also used by others to advance a partisan cause.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as soon as he made his accusations, people started to flock to him, and they recognized in him a weapon that they had not had up until this point. Chief among them, or one of them, was a guy forgotten today, but Alfred Kohlberg, who was had made a fortune in importing textiles from China. And he was convinced that American diplomats had sold out China to the communists. And he believed in all the conspiracy theories. And when he heard about McCarthy's charge, he flew immediately from San Francisco to DC, sat down with McCarthy at the Mayflower, and they had a 3-hour conversation. And he just said, here's what you need to know. Here's everything. Let me tell you. And then from then on, really supported McCarthy, constantly sent him material, hooked him up with other people in that world, other ideologues. He helped bring in staff. He was critical to getting Roy Cohn in front of McCarthy as a potential employee.
McCarthy is a really seminal figure, even though he burns out and through his destroys himself through alcoholism and there are other things that happen which we should talk about. But you've got Roy Cohn is brought into his sphere and becomes his counsel. And William F. Buckley becomes his chief apologist and writes a book about him. And that's in some ways also, the beginning of the kind of conservatism that has evolved to the moment where we are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting when Cohn came into McCarthy's sphere, he really helped. I describe him as sort of the CEO of McCarthy Incorporated. I mean, he was the guy who brought a semblance of order. And this was in 1953, after the Republicans had taken back the Senate, and McCarthy had chairmanship of the Government Operations Committee. So he had a much bigger staff and a lot more resources. And Cohn was the one who came in and said, okay, here's how we organize it. Here's what, all the different roles that people are going to play. And then he drove it forward, I think, further than McCarthy. I mean, McCarthy was happy to do anything that kept his name in the papers. But I think Cohn took things much further than McCarthy ever expected that they might go, in terms of like taking on George Marshall and the entire army. Were these things that McCarthy would have done anyway? Like, maybe, but Cohn did it in a way that ultimately destroyed them because he was so aggressive and so willing to go places where even McCarthy might have thought better of.
Well, he overreached, and of course, people in the government were aware that he was traveling with a close friend named David Paris, and that they may have had an intimate relationship. Interestingly, when they traveled to Paris, there was a press attaché in the embassy named Ben Bradley, who later became the editor of the Washington Post. He was my editor when I worked there. And in his memoir, he recounts how he and Art Buchwald, the great humorist of the day, were quite close. Buchwald was based in Paris. They were, they're a buddy movie, and how they made mincemeat of Roy Cohn's press conference in Paris.
Yeah,
I mean, he set himself up too, given his vulnerabilities.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that, Cohn's a fascinating character, and we all probably know, Kai Bird has a big biography of him coming out, and I'm very excited to read it, because so much of Cohn's story is how he managed to pick up from mistakes and rebuild himself. And you're right, he made a lot of mistakes while he was working with McCarthy, and it was essentially part of the price that McCarthy paid after the Army hearings. In order to avoid a worse censure than he received, he had to get rid of Cohn, and Cohn kind of ran back to New York. But as we all know, he rebuilt himself and, became the Roy Cohn that Donald Trump knew. Wow. And so he is a fascinating character in his own right. But
let's go back to Cohn before McCarthy. And one of the things that recommends him to McCarthy is his role in the Rosenberg case, which is a key episode in the Red Scare.
It's another passion play.
Yeah. And it is when people think about the intersection of the Red Scare and Jewish America, the Rosenberg case is the very center of that, because first of all, obviously the Rosenbergs were Jewish, and at the time there were a lot of people who wanted to connect Jewish America with radicalism, and that to make that one and the same. And that had been, that wasn't a new thing. That was often a stereotype of Jews. At the same time, you had a lot of Jews on the other side, Roy Cohn being one of them, but also many of the judges and lawyers involved in the Rosenberg case were Jewish. And
the judge, Kaufman.
Kaufman. Yeah. And Sam Roberts, my colleague, who wrote a very good book about David Greenglass, who is Ethel's brother. It's called The Brother. He grew up. He remembers this time in New York and what it was like to be in the Jewish community at the time. And he said, on the one hand, you'd have Jews say, how could the United States just ended World War II, ended the Holocaust. How could Jews do this to America? And on the flip side, with very much that same thing in mind, other Jews would say, how could America do this to Jews? And that was really, the dividing line in the community. But also the Rosenberg case brought out really ugly anti-Semitism in America. So much of the so there were a lot of protests in their favor. There was a lot of counter-protesting, a lot of violence, and a lot of it, and it was always tinged with anti-Semitism. And, the Red Scare was ugly in itself, but what it brought out in America in terms of its deep prejudices against African Americans, against Jews, against women, against gay people, it was really a kind of a smorgasbord of intolerance.
It's related to, for anyone who's seen the movie Oppenheimer, it's related to the Oppenheimer case, isn't it?
Yeah, which
is another key incident in the Red Scare.
It is. I think one of the things that the Oppenheimer case, and I think the movie's really good, really captures the right story. But so much of what the Oppenheimer case brings to light is, it's not that Oppenheimer was guilty or not. It's that he just wasn't fully in line with the diktats of the security state that emerged. And he was punished for that, and to some extent just made an example of. So many of these people that we're talking about, they set aside their guilt or innocence. They were often chosen because they were emblematic of something. So Oppenheimer becomes this sort of cautionary tale for people in the scientific community. and one that continued for a long time. And I think,
there's a lot of suspicion of science now, and and scientists are under attack now, and to some degree, in terms of the culture war, there's a continuity there, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's this weird. I think it's. I mean, we just talk about parallels over and over, but one of the ironies of the Red Scare, the early Red Scare, is the not just broad anti-intellectualism, but anti-science, anti-research, the sort of skepticism of experts, skepticism of education and of the educational system at a time when many other people, and I think objectively, we needed these things. We were in a Cold War with a country that had immense power to industrialize and to develop weapons and do its own science and research. And we're at a similar point today, right? We need really good educational systems. We need government funding for research. We need faith in science because I think, we are at a crossroads in geopolitics, and it's the next 10 years will determine whether the United States loses out to China and its satellites. And so we're really shooting ourselves in the foot. And we did the same thing in the early 50s.
Yeah, there's another aspect to the Red Scare I'd like you to speak about, which also resonates today, and that's the Lavender Scare, not just the Red Scare.
Right. Yeah, it's this is an area that for a long time people didn't really pay any attention to. And there's been some really good scholarship recently. There's also Thomas Mallon's book, Fellow Travelers, which then became a TV show that highlights this era. And on one level, it's, maybe not surprising that in a time of a conservative turn in America, there would be growing homophobia and intolerance toward gay people. But what's important at the time is how intricately interwoven it was with the Red Scare. So you had these accusations. So first of all, Washington, up until the late 40s, was relatively tolerant. It was a place where you could, as a gay man, be somewhat out of the closet, or at least to your friends. Like, there were clubs, there were bars, there was a community that was sort of in a gray area, which counted as progress. And then there was an immense, almost immediate crackdown starting in early 1950, goes back a little bit before that. And suddenly, if you were even suspected of being gay, you would lose your job, particularly if you were in State Department, Defense Department, anything that had to do with security. And the premise was very simple. Gay people could be blackmailed by the Soviets. Gay people were if they were in the closet, they were by definition liars, so you can't trust them. There's a gay cabal that operates sub rosa and may not have America's interests. Gay people are naturally radical. There's a long list. In fact, there was the first CIA director testified to this. There were 2 Senate hearings, separate investigations into gay people in the government. And the first CIA director presented this as, look, here are my 10 reasons why we have to get rid of every person. And it was enormously destructive. Obviously, at a time when we need really good, competent people in the State Department, we shouldn't be firing them for prejudicial reasons. But it also just, morale dropped. We destroyed countless lives. The Lavender Scare was a terrible mark on this country. And the fact that it was justified by security concerns only makes it more venal.
Yeah. Well,
Sid, I wanted to talk about change the subject a little bit and just talk about the ironies of everything that we've been talking about for the last bit.
I just want to say one thing before you get to the ironies, Sean.
Sure.
Which is there's a film that captures this atmosphere that you're just describing, Clay. And it's called Advise and Consent, based on the great Washington novel by Alan Drury of the time. And the whole, what's driving the plot is homosexual blackmail. And it's the first film ever made by Hollywood that shows a gay scene in a gay bar. And it gives you a good sense of the how threatening that all was to people at the time.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, absolutely.
The dome of fear that was over everything.
But and Sean, back to the irony.
I recognize the novel as well as the movie. But here's the irony. Okay. So the Cold War was framed, not unrealistically, not wrongly, as the contest between Soviet tyranny and American democracy. And that all of the things that you talked about were militated against a greater tyranny, a totalitarianism. All right. And so our big enemy was first Joseph Stalin, and then we go down the list. The irony is that these same kinds of techniques are being used to prop up a regime, or a much more aggressive regime than anything we saw under the Red Scare, that is aligned with Vladimir Putin.
That's the greatest irony, of course.
This, to me, is an extraordinary irony. And to the extent that we were talking about the anti-intellectualism, it's gone even beyond anti-intellectualism. And there's a great book I can also recommend by Richard Hofstadter called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And I would hope people would be able to get that one, which puts this in part of a long tradition of anti-intellectualism in American life, which has continued to today. We've gone beyond mistrusting the professors like me, and in the journalists like Sid and you as well, Clay. It's gone well beyond that to actually the destruction of truth itself, the proliferation of lies, and that anything refutes it is fake news. This is something that is the technique of a tyrant. It's a technique that Putin has, down very well. It's one of the reasons I think why Trump admires him so much. So in some ways, we're seeing exactly the same kinds of techniques as you describe in your book, but militated in this case not on behalf of democracy, but on behalf of tyranny. What do you think?
No, I agree completely. I think one of the places, I'm sure you'll agree, one of the reasons for studying history is not, in fact, a more important reason is not to look at the parallels between then and now, but actually the differences. What is it today that's different? And using techniques like irony, and contrast to look at what is new, why is it new, how is it different? And I think one of the things that's really important right now is that during the Red Scare, there was this premise that was not totally off base that we need to do these things because we're in an emergency. And you had an establishment. The Supreme Court itself, pre-Earl Warren, took this position and said, look, normally we would be really out there protecting freedom of speech. But right now, we need to pull back. Calmer times will come around and we will be able to go back to it, right? And, setting aside the validity of that, it was coming from an establishment that was in control, right? And you could at least take some solace in that idea. Right? That, look, at the end of the day, McCarthy's not president. Eisenhower's president. And Eisenhower is a centrist, moderate establishment guy. Today, we don't have anything like that. And in fact, it's the opposite. It is the administration. It is with frankly, a lot more power than the Eisenhower administration had to set the tones of the debate, to police whatever it determines is dissent. And to do it in the name not of some emergency, although they use that as a pretext, but really is to take more and more power over the culture and society. And that's where I think the similarity to not just Putin, but the autocratic playbook is really important, right? Because it's new for us. This is not how things worked in the Red Scare, but it's very similar to the way things have worked in particularly in Europe. Where Orban and to some extent, in Slovakia and Poland and certainly in Russia, you've seen it employed.
Yeah, Clay, we come to the ultimate question in your book, which is also the ending of your book, which is, how does this end? We know how the Red Scare ended, but why don't you tell us, we had Dwight Eisenhower as president. And it took him a while, but eventually he worked using his invisible hand to undermine McCarthy. after McCarthy attacked the army. And you quote Ike as saying in 1955, it's no longer McCarthyism, it's McCarthyism.
Yeah.
But there's another, so Ike is a very important figure in ending this, but there's another institution that's important, and that's the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And you describe, which people I think are very unaware of what happens on June 17th, 1953, and you call it the day the Red Scare ended. J. Edgar Hoover called it Red Monday. Why don't you tell us about the role of the Supreme Court in ending the Red Scare and the 4 cases that were decided on that day?
Yeah, so just as a little context, the Supreme Court, up until Earl Warren's arrival, and after, not long into the Eisenhower administration, the Supreme Court had been a facilitator of the Red Scare. It had consistently sided with government power in terms of cracking down on free speech, freedom of association, policing powers of dissent, often on that premise, as I mentioned, that we're in a dangerous time. And but also it was largely incoherent. Different people had different members of the court had different justifications. And Earl Warren came around and really brought order. First of all, brought order. He was
he's the Chief Justice now.
And he's appointed when is he appointed by Eisenhower?
53.
Right. Okay.
Late 53. And Earl Warren was a law and order guy from California. He was understood to be liberal in a lot of ways, but in the way a Republican liberal was at the time.
He had been governor of California.
Yeah, he had very, supported the internment of Japanese Americans. He had been the prosecutor in Alameda County in Oakland, had gone after radicals in the 1920s. So he was not necessarily the guy you would think would suddenly embrace a campaign against the tools of the Red Scare. But I go into this in the book, but there were a number of cases where he kind of had his eyes open. And he really took to Hugo Black as a tutor. And Hugo Black is one of the great civil libertarians ever to be on the court. And with that, he built up a number of small cases until Red Monday, in June 1957, they handed down 4 cases together, and each one of these took aim at a different aspect of the Red Scare. Could a state fire a professor because he had said such and such, or holds?
This is the case of Sweezy versus New Hampshire. Paul Sweezy.
Yes,
Paul Sweezy. Yes,
a Marxist economist.
Right. What were, how far could HUAC or, Congress go in its subpoena power and its investigatory power? Could it simply embarrass and shame people, or did it have to have more of a pretext? Right. These are, and to describe them, some of them sound like, kind of procedural things, but they were really important in terms of just saying the court is no longer going to allow Congress and the FBI and states to do whatever they want in the name of some constructed emergency. We're going to pull back on that. And, as you said, Hoover called it Red Monday. There was a huge backlash against this on the right. And there's a sense that the court is no longer on the side of the Red Scare. And, I think Warren is known for Gideon versus Wainwright. He's known obviously for school desegregation, Brown, but I think he deserves equal support or equal renown for being the guy who defanged the Red Scare.
And this is civil liberties.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's the thing that I think he came to understand was he had been a law and order. He always was a law and order guy, but he understood that there had to be checks, that law and order, that the legal police powers of the state had to be checked. They could not be trusted to operate on their own. And that, that is a premise that runs through his entire career on the court. And, HUAC continued. HUAC remained until 1975, but it was defanged. There were all sorts of attempts to continue to go after alleged communists, but the powers to do that had been removed by Warren. So look, a lot of people get credit for helping bring the Red Scare to an end. Edward R. Murrow certainly deserves credit. Eisenhower, but I think Warren, in the end, is the one who maybe deserves the most credit.
But law and order has to be built on the rule of law, and he understood that.
Yeah,
we'll see how this Supreme Court reacts now to this reign of witches, as Sean reminds us Jefferson said in another scare. So with that, with Earl Warren ending the Red Scare with his decisions in favor of civil liberties, we want to thank Clay Risen. We commend his book to everyone, Red Scare. And on behalf of Sean Wilentz and myself, the Court of History is adjourned.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.